Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this event on the brink of a new oil crisis, implications for the MENA region. Okay, we have some problem with Mr. Luciani, but anyway, don't worry. So for today, we are looking at this event, which comes actually really on the, I'd say at a great time, given that oil prices have shot up from the lowest levels in 2020 to the highest levels since 2014. So the highest in 8 years and some of the highest ever. We've seen them reaching $125 per barrel and even shooting up from there. And now we are at 115, at least in Brent oil price, and that's where we are at. And clearly, the Russia-Ukraine crisis is precipitating events, both for the invasion and for the sanctions that can be imposed and have already been imposed on oil exports from Russia. Part of it is also due possibly to the reaction of other market players in the oil sector. We've seen the OPEC cartel especially deciding to go forward with some more increasing in production, but following the previous schedule and not, for now at least, increasing it. So it's a particularly important time. Most commodity prices have shot up over the past few days and weeks, and not just oil. And this is a particularly critical time for the MENA region to reflect on the implications of the current crisis in Europe on them, which is to me interesting because it's one of the first times that I've seen a crisis in Europe, originating in Europe, impacting on the region that we're commenting upon, which is right now I'd say an important event and a significant reversal on what we've been expecting to see from Europe in terms of crisis. So let me present the experts joining me today. So I'll start with Professor Luciani, Giacomo Luciani. He is scientific advisor at the Master for International Energy at the Paris School of International Affairs of Sciences Po. Then we have Carol Nakle, founder and chief executive officer of Crystal Energy. Thank you for joining us. Li Chen Sim, assistant professor at Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi. And then Nasser Al-Tamimi, Senior Associate Research Fellow at ISPI. So thank you for joining us. Let me start from Professor Luciani, which I know he has previous commitments, so he will be with us for only a few minutes. So let me start from him. According to the International Energy Agency, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Western sanctions on Moscow could trigger the global oil market's biggest supply crisis in decades. And I guess part of it we've already been seeing today. So what's your opinion on this? What's your take? And how does this impact both the markets and the geopolitics of the MENA region? And maybe also how these countries talk with European countries in these weeks.
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me and for patience with the quality of the connection. I'm speaking to you from the garden of Sciences Po, where we have I have numerous students chatting around, so there will be background noise. I think there are several important things to be said. First of all, the volatility in oil prices was there even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the increase in prices took place throughout the latter part of 2020 and most of 2021. That is originating from the fact that investment in upstream oil and gas has declined rapidly over the past few years, while demand has recovered very quickly. So we live in a world in which production is lagging behind demand for oil and gas. And so that justifies the high prices. Of course, the invasion of Ukraine has created conditions potentially even worse. However, I personally do not expect that even the formal imposition of sanctions on Russian oil, I'm speaking, not necessarily gas, and or in alternative, the informal sanctions that we see today, whereby European buyers are simply not buying Russian oil. Nobody told them that they should not, but the implications of buying oil from Russia are such that they refrain from doing so. That doesn't necessarily mean that that oil will be lost for the global supply. It may have to be rerouted to different destinations, to refineries outside of Europe. It may have to be sold and is being sold at a great discount of $35 per barrel. So Russia is losing out significantly on the very high prices. They are not getting those high prices, but it is not necessary to envisage a major physical supply crisis, especially if the European countries are willing to undertake some of the 10 points that the International Energy Agency has suggested for conserving oil, which include, no cars on weekends or alternate plates in different days and things like that. All things that we can achieve, certainly.
So thank you. Thank you. It's interesting that you note that we have at our disposal these, energy-saving measures on the demand side, which is also, politically relevant because most of the discussion nowadays in Europe is mostly focused on the supply side, also given, possibly on the expectation that maybe the public opinion wouldn't support so much sanctions to Russia if we had to then impact the demand side of the equation, so conserve energy and maybe, for instance, do weekends without cars on the road or alternating. But anyway, let me turn again to the MENA region, which is. So my question is, we've seen how this impacts on Europe and might impact on the demand side, but what do you expect this crisis to affect the MENA region, and so those countries that are still rentier states, oil dependent, and have embarked on an energy transition and on a green transition. So do you think this will be slowed down, or this will be just a short-term spike, but then on the longer term the transition will continue, or what's your take?
No, I think there will be profound consequences on the MENA region in the sense that what we are witnessing is a realignment of priorities in our countries, in Europe and the United States and in all the democratic countries. The old mantra, which was that by promoting trade and greater economic interdependence, we would eventually promote peace and also democratization. This has proven wrong, and we need to rethink about it. So this will affect also the MENA region. In the immediate countries, our countries are hoping that Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates will produce some more oil, but I think this is just a short-term position. In the longer term, I think we will become much more selective in choosing our providers and our energy model in order to reduce dependence on governments whose record on human rights and international relations is really not in line with our expectations.
So thank you, Professor Luciani, for spending some time with us. Our audience must know that you have a previous commitment, so we have to say goodbye to you and thank you for these comments.
Again, my apologies for having to leave you, but that's life.
No worries at all, and actually I hope to see you soon at an e-speed event. But thank you for setting the stage for this discussion between our next three speakers. And so thank you again.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye to all the friends on the panel.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye. So let me turn to Carol and ask her. So we've seen, as Professor Luciano was telling us, this kind of tight market, and usually over the past few decades, especially the past 2 decades, I would say, we usually saw Western governments asking the OPEC cartel and mostly big oil producers to come and save us, in a sense. So you would expect supply to be revised up from these countries. And in fact, instead, OPEC Plus, so both OPEC and also other countries, including Russia, have decided for now to keep their outlook for more oil production stable, and even in a sense, I guess, given some market information that we get, maybe even a bit reducing their output over the past few weeks. So, what do you think? Why do you think it's happening, and what's your take on these current events that are different from what we would expect?
Good evening, Matteo, and good evening, everyone. Well, look, I mean, I've been trying to get my head around OPEC Plus decision to stick to a strategy or a plan that they agreed on in July 2021, when the conditions were pretty different from what we have today. And for me, whatever I look, I don't find the numbers or the facts adding up. And let me tell you why. First of all, let's try to understand what OPEC Plus is telling us. So they say, look, we don't have, the prices are where they are today, not because there are supply shortages, but because of geopolitical risks. So there is a fear sentiment, and the fear is driving prices up. This is also maybe true. There is definitely a geopolitical risk premium embedded into prices today. But nobody knows how much that is. We've been engaging some guesswork, but really nobody knows how to quantify that risk premium. What we know today is that when you have a tight market, then any geopolitical developments, especially that involving important players, is going to result in greater volatility, and that's what we're having today. So let's go back to OPEC's argument that the market, there are no supply shortages, and therefore there's no need to deviate from our plan that we agreed on in July last year. Well, I can see where they are coming from, but this is where I'm getting confused. First of all, just look at OPEC's website, look at their press releases, publications, speeches. Almost in every single one of them, there is reference to OPEC's dedication to market stability, which is at the heart of their mission. They don't say we want to achieve a certain price target. They say that we are dedicated to market stabilization. And therefore, you would expect them, as they do when prices go down and they rush to cut supplies to put upward pressure on prices, you would expect them to play a similar role, albeit in different direction, when the market is like what we are facing today. Now, you may say, okay, what about supply shortages? There are no supply shortages. But even if there are fears currently in the market, fears drive expectations about, what will happen next. And as a result, you can adjust your behavior today. So you can step in as the model that is the stabilization force that you describe yourself. You can step in and say we are ready to correct any whatever deviations in the market. So even that is going to calm a little bit the market, and we haven't seen that from OPEC. What we saw is actually a very unhelpful statement from Saudi Arabia recently, where they said that they warned of risk of attacks from the Houthis on their own production facilities, and that is going to cause greater fear in the market. But then the other point I wanted to highlight is that if you read their oil market monthly report of February, which was published earlier this month, I think it was last week, then you can see that actually they describe the market, they say prices are where they are today for 3 reasons. One, a strong fundamentals, which is a strong demand growth, and anyway that what they are expecting for the rest of the year, for this year, is twice as much as the IEA, for example, has forecast for oil demand. They put second, the recovery from the pandemic, and only third, the geopolitical developments and the war in Ukraine. So that's where I think that the numbers are not adding up, because if they believe that the market is tight, then therefore you would expect them to step in. And if you see that inventories are below the 5 years average, which is their targets. That's what they wanted to achieve. Also, you wonder why they are stepping in. Now, some might say that they haven't seen any sign of demand destruction. The demand is strong. Well, I tell you what, historically, we are always late in spotting demand destruction, because by the time it happens and we can see it, it becomes visible, actually, it has already happened and you end up playing catch-up game. So to sum up, I think what is driving OPEC Plus strategy today, it's not purely based on market fundamentals. I feel that there is also a political element affecting their decision, and that's why what we are seeing to date in terms of their strategy. It might change depending on how the talks go with, let's say, between the US and Saudi Arabia, but at the moment, all the signs we're getting is that they are sticking to their agreement.
Thank you so much, Carol. Carol Nakle, Chief Executive Officer of Crystal Energy. I think that, the main takeaway, and then I'll get back to you, but let me move to Professor Lee Chen-Sim. Maybe the main takeaway that I get from here is there might be some political implications, also, some economic implications that are maybe lost to us for now. It's true that, for instance, the OPEC statement that came out in early March did not mention that much the Russian invasion, and I will be curious to see, let's say in 2 weeks, what they will say about something in March. And it's so interesting what you said, that we don't see a demand disruption until it's too late, and so maybe this could also, entail that it could be a problem for the OPEC cartel and the producers if demand is disrupted too much, right? And then the oil price crashes on the back of an economic recession, maybe even global economic recession. So this is interesting, and there are so many forces at work, given the unprecedented situation created by the invasion. So let me turn to Professor Lee Chen-Sim to ask her, from your perspective in the UAE, and from what you can tell us, how do you see both the economics and the politics of this affecting maybe relationships between Saudi Arabia, the Arab Emirates, and Qatar on one hand, and Russia on the other, and maybe among them also? And do you think there will be regional consequences of this current geopolitical crisis in Europe?
Okay, thank you for that. Before we talk about what has changed with the invasion, let's talk a little bit about how Russia and the other Gulf states actually conduct their energy relations. So at a global level, obviously there's the OPEC Plus energy governance body. And at the local level, you have the individual markets in which they compete in. So at a global level, we see cooperation, obviously with the OPEC Plus pact that has been in place since late 2016. I think that they will continue cooperating, as Carol has mentioned, for some maybe slightly questionable economic reasons, but I think they will still cooperate with the pact, because Russia will still be the second largest OPEC producer largest oil producer in OPEC Plus for a while, even if its oil is sanctioned, because it will still be producing and it will still be exporting oil. Hence, it will still impact global supply and by extension prices. So I think the Gulf states are going to want to continue cooperation with Russia to that extent. Also, mentioning the political reason, the reason why they would want to continue cooperation at global level is that OPEC Plus acts as a platform to actually cement Russian political engagement and presence in the region, right? For various reasons, the Gulf states find it appealing for Russia to be engaged here. And of course, on Russia's side, it likes the status and the global cachet that comes with that. So I think at a global level, we'll continue to see cooperation. At a local level, however, I think it's quite interesting, because the invasion means that we're going to probably see quite, in the short term, not much impact, but I think in the medium term, I think that we will see increasing competition in Asia. Right, because Russia, as the professor mentioned, is going to be shut out effectively of the European markets. They will look increasingly to Asia. Perhaps we may see some more loans for oil agreements between Russia and China. So whatever the case is, I think Russia is going to have to look to Asia, and that's where they run up against competition with the other Gulf states, for whom, of course, China and India are huge markets, much larger than Europe. So I think we're going to see long-term competition here. Asia is where the growth in oil consumption will be. For gas, there is a lot of room in Asia for a coal to gas switch, unlike in Europe. So I think that's where you're going to see a lot of competition. I realized that your question was, on oil and on gas, but I think it's quite important also to mention, since you talked about energy relations, nuclear. What's the implication for that? It's because Russia is building nuclear power plants in Egypt and Turkey. So here, if I move away from the Gulf a little bit, I think we're going to see a bit of delicate relations here because of the invasion. Both these plants are being built by Russia's Rosatom, but it's actually procuring some equipment from non-Russian suppliers like General Electric for the steam turbines, for example, in both these plants in Egypt and Turkey. South Korea has also been roped in to provide engineering services in Egypt. But of course, GE and South Korea, they are, American and South Korea are on the list of so-called unfriendly countries for Russia. So not sure how the plant is going to continue without disruptions. And of course, there's a question about financial sustainability of Russia financing these plants. So even outside of the Gulf area, there's going to be that kind of impact on Russia's relations in the Middle East.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And again, thank you, Professor. I'll get back to you later. But what I maybe take from this, it's interesting the complexities of the whole market and maybe even political implications. We've seen over the past few days news coming from Europe, which are talking about a huge shortage of diesel products, right? Which are, obviously oil-derived products, and they usually came from Russia. Half of our consumption in Europe comes from Russia, and we've already seen talk of Saudi refineries replacing some of that diesel. So as Russia looks to Asia, maybe some Gulf countries are looking to Europe, and this complex interplay, might, be interesting to study over the next few weeks and months as this happens. But let me turn to Nasser Al-Tamimi, and let me ask you, given the complexities, we've already seen a heavily sanctioned country, Iran, since 2012, and then the discussions and the negotiations around that, cutting supply of oil, especially exports, let's say pushing some countries to look for ways to import anyway part of that oil in the markets, especially the non-sanctioning countries. And now we are seeing a different situation in Russia, in which there are, for instance, no sanctions, at least for now, on secondary. So no secondary sanctions on Russia, so no sanctions from the sanctioning country to other countries that might acquire oil, but still a lot of countries self-sanctioning themselves, a lot of companies, and not importing that oil for fear of being sanctioned. So Europe is cutting down, and other countries as well that might even look to buy that oil in the future are still buying it today at a huge discount, given that there is not so much demand. So my question to you is, do you see any relationship between this and the Iranian situation, and how could this impact on the negotiations for the Iran nuclear accord, and maybe how could a possible accord and agreement impact on the oil situation? So, sorry, many questions, but I let you explain.
Thank you, Matteo, and good evening, everyone. In general, any additional oil coming to the market will be welcome from everyone, especially the consumer. And the way you look at it now, they said that the agreement with the Iranian or the nuclear deal will be, closing in maybe a few days or a few weeks. Or if the Iranian oil coming to the market, I think it will have some significant impact. Maybe not in a few days or a few weeks, but in short term, it will be a good news for the market and good news even for Asian market or to some countries in Europe. But the question, how much the Iranian will bring to the market? If you ask the Iranian, the government latest figures, they will tell you they will bring online maybe 1.4, very optimistic, figures, 1.4 million barrel within 2 months. But others, they're less as optimistic. The IEA or the International Energy Agency, they might take 6 months. Others even maybe less optimistic, will take about 9 months. But for Iran also, don't forget, they also hold about maybe 60, 70 to 90 million barrel in storage, and most of it in Asia now. And that they could bring it quickly in the market, and that will affect to some extent, put some downward pressure on the prices of oil. But the oil from Iranian alone, it's not enough. It will not compensate the Russian, losses in the market. And also, if it's not combined with action from OPEC, especially Saudi Arabia, the market will always become volatile. The up and down during what they explain, geopolitical problems. But as I said in the beginning, any additional oil coming to the market, either from Iran or different suppliers, will be good news for the market.
So let me again get back to you. But do you think that you told us about what could happen if the agreement is in place? But do you think that the conflict is going to affect or is already affecting the likelihood of a deal?
In my opinion, my personal opinion, I think the deal will go ahead, because if there is no deal, I don't know if the world can afford another crisis in the Middle East. If there is no deal with Iran, many hot spots in the Middle East, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, or it could escalate the situation. And the Iranians, they have the capabilities to escalate it in many, and that will put even a huge pressure in the oil prices. And so I don't know. I think the American, the European, they are pushing for a deal, and even the market is waiting for a deal. But still, there's no deal unless there is a real deal.
We've seen. I was mentioning this because we've seen some, say, speculations behind the curtains that possibly Moscow, Russia, was trying to slow down the deal with some last-minute requirements for it to come on board. So these speculations were clearly related to the fact that now Russia is and has an incentive for that oil not to come into the market, even though, as you said, it's not going to replace all, it might not replace all the Russian oil lost, but still it would be, it would put a bit of a downward pressure on prices. And right now, Russia clearly has an incentive to play the part of being the market player that might restabilize the market so that sanctions do not go on. So it's an interesting situation in which, again, an ally in many cases of Russia, Iran, which has an incentive to get a deal done, still might, look at other pressures from Russia. So I'm just looking at giving this picture for our audiences. So thank you. Anyway, I'll get back to you. But let me get back to Carol for a second question that is more regional, less global in its impact, specifically on the MENA countries. We've talked with Professor Luciani on how these oil prices might affect the transition of the, let's say, rentier states, so the oil producing and oil exporters. But still, we have a lot of countries in the MENA region that are oil importers and are heavily dependent both the exporters and importers, on subsidized fuels. So given the oil prices up and many commodity prices going up and so on, how do you feel that this might lead, where do you feel that this might lead us in terms of both the political stability and the economic stability of the region?
That's a very big question for the simple reason is that it's difficult to group the MENA and see it as a one coherent region because it's really a very mixed bag. On the surface, we distinguish between the net importers, oil importers, and the net oil exporters. And of course, the net oil exporters are enjoying some windfall revenues these days because of the increase in prices. And that will have, positive impact on their economy, especially, and I would say that at the condition that the revenues or the additional gains are invested wisely. But even the net oil exporters are themselves divided. So you do have those that have built stronger economies than others, like, for example, the UAE, where I'm sitting, or Kuwait, and they have very big sovereign wealth fund when they are accumulating more money into them. And you have in the middle of the spectrum, I would say, Saudi Arabia. I'm not looking at only today, I'm looking at least the last 10 years. And you can see, yes, they have made some progress, but they still have some way to go. And they are the more fragile net oil exporters, the likes of, for example, Iraq. And among the group of net oil exporters, I would also include Iraq as a country that I'm a bit concerned about, despite the rise in prices because of other things. But I'll come back to that in a minute. For the net oil importers, of course, if you were in a country like in North Africa, or even, in the Middle East, including country like Lebanon, where I come from, and you are importing fuels to run your electricity or to sustain your economy, your import bills are going to be quite burdensome. And it's not only the oil bill, it's also additional. Don't forget that we are going through a massive increase in commodity prices. And I would find what is more threatening for these economies are the price, for example, of things such as grains, wheat. Egypt is the largest importer of wheat in the world. Just think about the repercussion the increase in wheat prices has had on the Egyptian economy. I look at other countries in the region, I only see trouble among the net importers. Think of Tunisia, for example, and the risk of it defaulting on its debt. And that will have by itself repercussions in some countries which already had a fragile situation, that will have repercussions on the social aspect. We should expect to see riots, I would say, and that will spell trouble to the political stability in some countries. So it's not as easy as say, okay, you have A and you have B, and that's it, and the situation is clear cut. But I want to go back to the issue of the net oil exporters. There's always a silver lining. When I said that they are benefiting from higher revenues and therefore that will support their own economies, but they can also support the struggling economies in the region. We saw, for example, the kind of developments between the UAE and Egypt that took place recently. And that is a kind of part of a bigger package on political collaboration, but there is also an achieving similar interest, meeting certain common goals, in addition to supporting their economy. But in terms of subsidies, just to go back to your question, so I had to make this introduction just to understand how complex the situation is, and therefore any answer I'm going to give you is going to be rather simplistic. But I think many countries in the region, of course, we have to acknowledge that already some countries have implemented a subsidies reform. And if you remember, a few years ago when the IMF looked at the fossil fuel subsidies in the world, they found that half of those were given in the MENA region. So the region's energy prices were heavily subsidized. But progress has been made in that direction. We saw several countries reforming their energy prices, though they still have some way to go before achieving market prices, or at least the prices that are desirable to improve efficiency in terms of demand consumption, at least, and avoid wasteful consumption. But I think the opportunity was missed also when prices were low. Usually when prices are low, that is a golden opportunity for reforming energy subsidies. But when prices are high, despite the economic rationale behind it, I find it really difficult from a political economy perspective, because as you can see, households everywhere, and the MENA region in particular, especially in the poorer economies in the region, they are already stretched. They are stretched too thinly because all this is happening at the back of a recovery from a crisis like no other, and that was the pandemic. So it's not like we have this crisis when everything was going fine. We had this crisis when already in many countries people lost their jobs, or they lost, the value or whatever they were making lost its value, and that by itself is actually making me more worried, not from an economic perspective only, but also from a political perspective, with the impact on the society, the social makeup, the potential of protest, and the threats to some maybe political systems in the region.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this. And clearly, we had to simplify, but I think you've been absolutely encompassing to give us a picture of where the region is at. And I'm reminded, you've been kind to point at Egypt. I'm reminded also of, even of Lebanon's situation, given that it's your country. The price of wheat, we've been reading, at least I've been reading this article on the Financial Times, I think earlier today, which was recounting the story of those who need, wheat. And there's Egypt, but there's also Lebanon, and we know this comes on the back of both the pandemic, but also the crisis of 2020. So clearly, some countries that have already been ravaged economically are now experiencing this increase in commodity prices, as you said, overall, which I'm reminded, at least it reminds me of, obviously, of the previous cycle of protests, right? So about a decade ago in 2011, we know where it started. It was in Tunisia, and it was due to many factors, but obviously also due to some commodity prices being shooting up, right? And then, let's say, providing the fuel to some protests that were already starting to simmer. So my question that I now turn to Professor Lee Shem-Sim, what's your take on the political stability of the region, and how is both oil prices but commodity prices as well going to impact, in your opinion?
Well, I do agree with Carol that it's very simplistic to say that, the net oil exporters will benefit, whereas the net oil importers won't benefit. But, to an extent, yes. Certainly, there's a huge cushion for the GCC economies. If you imagine that oil at $100 per barrel, if it continues over the course of 2022, is going to add something like 650 billion extra to the combined coffers of the GCC countries. That's a lot of cushioning for the GCC. So they will be able to, for example, maintain or increase investments for oil and petrochemicals, something that Professor Giacomo was worried about, but they'll be able to do that easily. They will be able to try to speed up on their solar projects, assuming that they can get the nickel and the other things that they need for that. They can speed up on upgrading their human resources, which is something that they're trying to do with Emiratization and Omanization and etc. They can be a bit more cushioned from the food security because they can outbid the lesser endowed countries for scarcer wheat, for example. They can maintain subsidies if needed. And I think also more interestingly, they have room to cut the VAT. Because they've got this financial cushion, they have the room to cut the VAT if necessary to reduce some of these inflationary pressures on food, on housing, etc., which was, part of the reason for the spiraling prices, was part of the reason for the Arab Spring. And indeed, we saw some protests in Oman in 2000 during the Arab Spring, but at least there's room now to cut VAT in the Gulf countries. But I also agree with Carol that the net oil importers can leverage on GCC, the cushion that they have, right? Not just in Lebanon, where who knows, they may get a bailout. Investments in Turkey's economy, UAE was investing already before this crisis. So perhaps they're going to invest more. Maybe there is a way for them to prop up Turkey's economy without Turkey having to go to the IMF. But it's not just in the region. Because with the GCC cushioning, they can also be more active in, say, taking part in renewable energy projects in some of these post-Soviet states like Uzbekistan or Armenia, which can also benefit from the non-fossil fuel-based power. And of course, that helps the geopolitical weight of the GCC oil countries. But I think something which I'd like to add is that the rising oil prices, yes, they can benefit the Gulf states and the net oil importers, but I think it also potentially widens the gap among the oil exporting countries, let's say in the GCC. Why would that be so? Well, because I think with these increasing oil prices, there's more money at stake, so that there'll be more competition between Saudi Arabia and the UAE as business hubs. We saw the competition earlier, but with the rising oil prices, they have more to spend. They have more to gear up their economies to attract foreign investment, for example. So I think we see more competition. And I also think that there's going to be, it might widen the gap among oil exporters, because they are going to try to want to sell off some minority stakes in various energy entities while the price of oil is high, right? And so if you sell off these stakes, you're going to get more efficiencies, increased performance, because there's more public scrutiny and therefore more transparencies. So who knows, who is going to be the last oil producer standing? It's probably these companies which have more open and transparent systems. And so therefore that would widen the gap between countries that have sold some of these minority stakes and those who are not likely to do so, like perhaps in Kuwait. So I think those are some of the implications that are quite interesting to tease out.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's very important to get into the nuances of all this. But let me now then turn to Nasser Al-Tamimi for this to close down this part, and maybe then open up to the Q&A session. We are already receiving a lot of your questions. If you want, you can still write to us. Remember, we are opening to questions. We already have about 5, so do not worry. But still, we're opening up. But let me introduce another, maybe the elephant in the room, right? So China. So the bigger players that are not sanctioning and might come in. Professor Sim was already mentioning them. Professor Luciani has mentioned them, and Carol has mentioned them as well. So their role in both maybe undercutting the role of sanctions right now from the West, but also how relations between China and the MENA region and China and Russia, in terms, of the oil market, might change as we look at this rebalancing. I'm refraining from also introducing India, that has already been mentioned, but let me just stick with maybe with China for the first part, and let me ask you, what do you expect to be happening? And then maybe this question can be then circulated around also when we open up the floor to questions and answers.
I think China relation with the GCC countries and Russia in energy sector will go to higher level in the next few years. If you look at the GCC countries now, China is the number one buyer for their oil and the number one trade partner for. And this picture, I don't think it will change for the next maybe decade. China now, if you look at the Ukrainian problem, they have a problem with the European Union, and because of the United States of their position regarding to the Ukrainian crisis. I think China now will look to the security, energy, and put it in the higher agenda. That's why I think it will, maybe not in the short term, it will push them more towards Russia, especially in the gas pipelines, and they can't expand it in the next few years. They can put it up to maybe 140 billion for the gas pipeline, and maybe they could expand it to 3 million barrel a day in all. And for the GCC countries, I think the high prices of the Ukrainian crisis, I think it will improve the relation even further between China and the GCC countries. And it will improve the trade. If you look last year, first time in history of their relation, the trade break the barrier of 200 billion. Their trade was about 230 billion because of the energy prices go up, and the Chinese export to the area also in the highest level in their history of their relationship. And I think this year this scenario or this dynamic will play again. That their relation will the trade will maybe hit another high level. Maybe I think it will hit 300 billion this year because of the prices. It won't go down more than 90 or maybe over $100 a barrel. And also investment. If you look at the investment, many Saudi companies now revive their investment in China. Aramco this month signed agreement about 10 billions petrochemical and refinery. SABIC will go ahead with 6 billion petrochemical also complex in China. And also the Crown Prince, in his latest interview with Atlantic, he said our investment in China about 100 billions, and we will grow it. And I think that trend will grow between China and GCC countries and China and Russia. But also the high prices also might have some negative impact, as you mentioned before about the global economy. If the high prices stay long for a longer period, it could affect the growth, the global growth, and also will affect China. And I think China now they will have a problem, challenging problem. They put their growth goal 5.5%. And I think with these prices and the commodities and I give you example, last year, China paid about 260 billion only for oil. And that amount will go up, and if you add the other commodities, oil and gas and many importing things to China, I think they will their growth will go down and will impact to some extent their oil demand maybe this year or next year.
This is an important point. Thank you, Nasser, because we often forget that it's not just politics, it's also economic pressures. And China is clearly the place where we're looking at in terms of both, let's say the fallout of sanctions and then oil, higher oil prices on possible economic growth, given that it's already been slowing down. And clearly this poses problem for Xi Jinping. So we often look at political pressures and political dynamics, but we should never overlook this. So thank you so much. And let me maybe open up then and take two questions and read to you two questions that have come that to me I think we can discuss with both Carol and Professor Sim. So the first is about OPEC+. And the question is, we've been focusing on the decisions by OPEC+ not to increase production. But the question says, considering that OPEC+ countries missed their production target by more than 1 million barrels per day in February, one could wonder what is the actual current state of health of the oil industry in the MENA region. Meaning, what are the most important industrial bottlenecks and the technical possibilities to raise productions? Meaning, the suggestion that it might not just be, policy-driven, but also a technical limitation in the field. And clearly, Carol and I guess Li Chen are the best poised to answer this. But let me get a second one, which is, we've seen the Saudi and UAE decision to oppose to Western pressures to increase the production, and this was clearly explicit. So there is, some policy decision. This was from the Saudi Arabia point of view, really an explicit point that they've been making diplomatically. We do not raise output for some reasons. Given this, we've also seen at the same time Qatar being much more accommodating with Western requests, and this time on gas supply. We've seen the Germany long-term agreement early this week. So what does this different attitude might tell us in terms of regional competition within the Gulf Cooperation Council? So what does this tell us about the health of the competition between countries in the GCC? And again, I'll let you choose who goes, but you can, Carol, if you want, you can start and then answer both or just one question.
I'm going to say just a few words on perhaps on both, but let me first of all start with the OPEC plus argument. That's something I keep on hearing. And I say, tell me something new, because who are the countries that are struggling to increase production? The usual suspects, the countries that already have been suffering for years from lack of investment, or they have not set in place the right framework to encourage investment in the industry, and their production was struggling. So there was like the Nigerias of this world, Angola and other countries. So these are the expected countries, so there were no surprise in any way. In terms of impact on markets, you have to keep your eyes on the main players in OPEC. I know that you, Matteo, I think you're going to make some people upset because you refer to OPEC as a cartel, but there is the aspect of spare capacity. And where is the lion's share of OPEC's spare capacity? It is concentrated in the GCC countries and largely in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So really, they are the movers and shakers within OPEC, and therefore, in terms of impact on the market, and they do have spare capacity that is there, and that's still more substantial in terms of its share of global supply than when we saw, for example, at the beginning of the century when it was below 1% of global supply. So really, we have to dig into the details and the numbers before saying, oh, OPEC is struggling. Some countries in OPEC are struggling, but there are other countries that are sitting on significant spare capacity, and they can support the market if they want to. Just to keep my on the health of the industry in the MENA, well, again, it's quite a colorful space. For example, in Algeria, you do have a struggle in terms of attracting investment and capital. And this has been an ongoing problem for years. I remember even when prices were 130 or 110 on average, averaging for the year over several consecutive years, still Algeria saw investment going down because of unattractive policy. Among the GCC countries, don't forget the massive plans that the likes of Aramco and ADNOC in the UAE announced in terms of their 5 years investment plan. They are massive, and they are moving ahead with these projects. So I think, it's a variety story. Iraq is actually impressive in terms of investment history, in terms of attracting, but they have other problems related to, regulation, policy, corruption, other things, but I will not go down that route. Let me just say a few words on Qatar and the competition. I see it more, of course, there is a political agenda behind, because it fits with what Qatar has been doing over the last few years. And don't forget that Qatar left OPEC because, anyway, they are more of a gas producers and really an oil consumer. But there was a golden opportunity that has arisen for Qatar in this case, that is regaining or actually increasing its market share in a very important market that is Europe, and probably use the opportunity to sign long-term LNG contracts, because, mind you, many buyers were trying to move away from the long-term contracts and prefer to buy gas on the spot market, whereas Qatar does sell some of its gas on the spot, but it's largely long-term contract. So that was more of a strategic move from Qatar in terms of seizing the opportunity and sign these long-term contracts with existing and new customers.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. Thank you for putting the spotlight on me and my definition of OPEC as a cartel. But let me just say, it's simply an organization of huge producer who has a large market share and sets some policy targets on production. So call it the way you want. So let me turn anyway the question to Li Chen. So what do you think is happening? And let me just comment on a thing. It's interesting, the Qatar movement, because seen from Europe, we've seen for years this movement that you described, Carol, towards the spot market as being described by the European Commission and by many market players as being convenient, and this would have made gas prices more affordable and easier to trade and so on, the market more liquid, despite many warnings that some big producers of gas would still be able in Europe to corner the market. And this is what happened exactly last year, when a producer, specifically Russia, with 40% of the market share in Europe of gas in Europe, could just, reduce supply, but just a tiny bit, and make prices balloon, right? They ballooned by 5 times, and now they are 8 times higher than the normal level, not the 2020 level that was depressed. But anyway, this was just a comment seen from Europe as strategies change, and Qatar has been arguing for a long time towards long-term contracts, and clearly this makes sense for them that Germany would sign in the end this kind of commitment to long-term supply instead of just looking at the spot markets. But let me turn to Li Chen. What do you think, both in terms of whether there are some bottlenecks and also in terms of GCC political dynamics?
Yeah, I think in terms of bottlenecks, as Carol mentioned, yes, you have to look at the 2 big ones, which have enough spare capacity. And the question that was raised is, are there technical reasons, why they cannot increase the amount supplied? And I would probably say that no, there are no technical reasons. I think that they could do it, but it's a political reason why they don't want to do it. Is because they don't want to undercut the OPEC Plus pact with Russia. They don't want to be seen as in stepping in to fill the possible void of the possible loss of Russian oil barrels. So I think that's a policy decision, and that the reason is to maintain the overall value of OPEC Plus, which, as I mentioned earlier, is quite important for global energy markets, but also very important for the Gulf in their relations with Russia, because that's the main platform they engage Russia in the energy world. Turning to the second question about regional competition, we've mentioned political reasons why there could be more regional competition. We've talked about economic reasons why there could be political competition, but I also think there is geological. It's a question of geology, right? Qatar is a gas producer, as you mentioned, more of a gas producer than as an oil producer. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are not huge gas exporters, so they don't actually compete in the same markets, right? Qatar competes, it's mostly in Europe, whereas Saudi and UAE are oil producers primarily, and so their market is Asia, right? I'm not saying that Qatar has got no Asian market, but they are a bit more flexible in that sense. So I think geology is also quite an important reason to think about regional competition within the Gulf.
Thank you so much, Li Chen.
Just let me add
yes,
something.
Sir, give me a second and let me add just one question to you specifically, because we're running out of time and I want to have some time for you. And sorry for those of us joining us, Carol and Li Chen, if you can stay just a few minutes, but I promise you we are ending shortly. And let me also, now in sending you these questions, let me also say we've received a lot of questions on Europe and the impact on the European market. So I'm sorry I cannot field these questions to this panel, but for sure there will be other events in ISPE in short time in which we will be able to discuss this in greater detail. So thank you all for asking this. But let me add you this question, Nasser. After Yemen's Houthi rebels struck Saudi energy facilities, Riyadh said they will not bear responsibility for any related shortages, as we discussed. To which extent do you think that could the war in Yemen play a role into the energy policies of both Saudi Arabia and Yemen? So how is this linked, and maybe also Iran's role in that field, if you can? But anyway, you can add, and please stick to 2 minutes of your time.
Okay, I just want to add some points to OPEC Plus, and it's not just a political reason. Saudi Arabia worked for that OPEC Plus years, negotiating with OPEC members and with Russia, and I don't think they will throw it away within minutes regarding what happening in Ukraine. So in my opinion, I think the Saudi and the Emirati, they will wait to see the whole picture of what will happen to Russia. There is a lot of uncertainty, about Russian oil ban, everything. So they will wait that, to see or assess the impact on Russia. And also they will see what will happen with Iran. And I think after these 2 points, they will decide their next step regarding to the oil. About Yemen, I think, in my opinion, it's linked to the nuclear negotiation. If the deal goes ahead, we might see the things calm down in that area, and Iran could help or facilitate negotiation with Saudi Arabia, and if the deal fall apart, we could see the opposite, more escalation and more impact in the oil prices.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much also for being short. And I'm sorry that I have to bring this to an end. But let me first thank you as an audience, but also thank you our standing speakers, Carol Nakle, Lee Chen Sim, and Nasser Al-Tamimi, because I'm sure that what I'm taking away from this is the market is complex, but I now know much more about the political dynamics in the region and how the invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions might have an impact on the region, how MENA is reacting. I think this was important to see you all, and thank you for your expertise and your time. And I hope to see you soon here, ISPI. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.